insight.
When we speak about South Africa's liberation history, we often remember political organizations, famous leaders, and major turning points. But there's another part of that history that cannot be separated from the struggle itself. It is the role of women. And if there is one date that captures that contribution, it is the 9th of August, 1956. On that day, more than 20,000 women marched to the Union buildings in Pretoria to protest the extension and enforcement of the Apartheid laws against African women. The march was organized by the Federation of South African Women and was led by figures including Lillian Ngoyi, Helen Joseph, Rahima Moosa, Sophia Williams-de Bruyn. But here's what makes the event politically significant. These women were not simply protesting one piece of legislation. They were challenging another political system that controlled where they could live, where they could work, how families could remain together, and how freely they could move. The past system was therefore not simply an administrative requirement, it was a part of a wider system of racial control. And women had already been resisting these kinds of restrictions long before 1956. Now, in 1913, women in the Orange Free State protested permit requirements imposed on them, organizing petitions and demonstrations against restrictions on their government. So the 1956 march did not appear from nowhere. It came from decades of political organizing. And this is where the Women's Charter becomes more important. Adopted by the Federation of South African Women in 1954, the Charter demanded more than the removal of discriminatory laws. It called for equality in employment, equal pay, political rights, and equal matters involving property, marriage, and children. So in other words, women were not simply asking apartheid to treat them better. They were imagining a fundamentally different society, a society based on equality, and that distinction matters because liberation was never only about removing apartheid, it was also about deciding what kind of society would replace it. So women therefore participated in the liberation struggle through protests, political organizations, community mobilizations, trade union activity, underground political work, and civil resistance. They were organizers, they were activists, they were political thinkers, they were also leaders. The 1956 march demonstrated this on a massive scale. More than 20,000 women arrived at the Union building and presented petitions opposing their past laws. They then stood in silence for 30 minutes before expressing their defiance through protest. The significance of this moment goes beyond the number of people who attended. It demonstrated that women could mobilize across racial and social divisions around a common political demand. And that changed the perception of women within the liberation movement itself. The struggle continued decades after 1956. Women remained involved in resistance to apartheid, including mass mobilizations, political organization, and community struggles. We are going to talk about figures such as Albertina Sisulu, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, Helen Joseph, Lillian Ngoyi again, Sophia Williams-de Bruyn, who became associated with different dimensions of the broader liberation struggle. But we should be careful not to reduce women's liberation history to a list of famous names. Thousands of women whose names were never entered into history books also participated. They organized communities, they raised families under extraordinarily difficult political conditions. They joined campaigns, they protested, they sustained political movements, and they created the social foundations upon which resistance could continue. Then came 1994, where South Africa transitioned to a constitutional democracy and political equality became a fundamental principle of the new democratic order. The struggle had moved from resisting exclusion to constructing institutions based on universal citizenship and constitutional rights. And this is where the meaning of the 9th of August changes. We no longer simply remembering a protest. We are asking what that protest was trying to achieve. The women of 1956 were demanding freedom of movement, dignity, and equality. The democratic South Africa that emerged in 1994 constitutionally committed itself to equality and a non-sexist society. It is in the Constitution. So Women's Day should not simply be about remembering what women did in the past. It should also make us ask whether the promises of liberation have been fully realized. Because political liberation and social liberation are not necessarily the same thing. The women who marched on 9th of August 1956 were not simply asking to be included in an existing political system. They were challenging the system itself, and perhaps that is the most important lesson of Women's Day. Liberation is not only about changing who governs, it is about changing the conditions under which people live. So when we remember the women of 1956, we should remember more than the march. We should remember the political imagination behind it, the courage to organize, the willingness to challenge authority, and the belief that democracy should mean more than simply having the right to vote. Because the road to South African democracy was walked by millions of people, and women were not walking behind the liberation struggle. They were walking within it. And on the 9th of August, they made that impossible to ignore. This has been the special edition desk only on SFTB Network.